In the year 2020, law-abiding Americans purchased more self-defense firearms than they had in any year previous. In 2021, they did it again. There's not any mystery about how and why that happened. We have reams and reams of polling data that tell a very clear and convincing story. Americans have been purchasing pistols and rifles in record numbers for over 2 years because they no longer trust their elected leaders and their law enforcement officials to uphold their duty of promoting law and order and keeping the citizenry safe from the depredations of violent criminal psychopaths. Additionally, in the years 2020 and 21 both, an overwhelming majority of those gun purchasers had never owned a firearm previously. About half of those were black, Latino, and Asian. And a large majority of them hail from cities and states controlled by woke Democrats. We've talked before about the phenomenon of the self-licking ice cream cone, where government bureaucrats create a problem for themselves to solve, then furiously pat themselves on the back for being such great problem solvers. And in the third decade of the 21st century, there may be no self-lickinger ice cream cone in our nation's capital than the Democrats and their gun-grabbing obsession. Joe Biden wants to grab your gun so bad, I think he mistook it for a comely preteen girl with really nice-smelling hair. In other words, you bought a gun last year or the year before not because you necessarily had any desire to become a gun owner, but because your local Democrat politicians and police chief and prosecutor have made it abundantly clear that they are on the side of the criminals, as evidenced by the explosion of violent crime that's been rocking your hometown for upwards of 2 years now. And so now Joe Biden and those same Democrats, they want to take that gun away from you because some sick bastard kid in Texas who liked to wave around bags of dead cats went and shot up a school. You see how that ice cream cone licks itself? We created this crisis with our own incompetence and corruption, and now the only way to solve it is by you surrendering your rights and giving us more power. Isn't that great? Doesn't that make you be proud to be an American living in the freest country in all of God's creation? Because it certainly does make my chest swell with patriotic fervor, I can tell you that. Now, I don't know if you saw this speech that President Biden, such as he is, gave last night where he entered the room through 2 rows of candles lined up on the ground, which was really, really weird and creepy. Especially when you've got a president who, if you just put the black hat on his head, would be an absolute dead ringer for Reverend Kane from Poltergeist 2. So I don't know what sort of vibe they were going for here, but it didn't work. It wasn't quite as comically humiliating as when Nancy Pelosi and crying Chuck Schumer wrapped themselves up in kente cloth and took a knee for St. George Floyd in the Capitol Rotunda, but it was pretty damn close. There's not really any need to do a detailed takedown and refutation of this speech because we know the drill by now. Joe gets up there, he says a bunch of things that are either mostly untrue or spectacularly false. He mumbles unintelligibly much of the time. He does his creepy, whispery child molester voice when he wants to add extra emphasis, which I think is a trick he learned from his good buddy Justin Trudeau. And eventually he gets defeated by the teleprompter and retires up to the private residence for a nice evening of ice cream and Murder, She Wrote. And there is also not any need for listing all the legislative demands he made, because it is all the same crap that's been in the Democrat gun control grab bag for the last 20 or 30 years. But you know what this speech made me think of? Specifically the parts where he kept saying, "For God's sake, we've got to do something! Do something! For God's sake, do something!" It made me think of history's second greatest fictional rock star, Aldous Snow of Infant Sorrow, played by Russell Brand, a character you may remember from the films Forgetting Sarah Marshall and Get Him to the Greek. In the first of those pictures, we are first introduced to Aldous Snow when we see the music video for his latest hit single, a song called "We've Got to Do Something." And the song is a note-perfect parody send-up of your typical idiotic virtue-signaling celebrity who's trying to sound all socially conscious, but just winds up vomiting out a bunch of meaningless nonsense. And it's hard to believe the song came out 15 years ago because it's probably more fitting for the current political moment than it was for that moment, where now the President of the United States delivers nationwide primetime addresses in which he sounds very much like Aldous Snow, if Aldous Snow was an 80-year-old semi-animated cadaver who can't tell his wife from his sister. But anyway, there's a spoken word passage at the end of that song, wherein Aldous tries to lay out his political worldview, and it goes a little something like this. You know, I'm sorry if this is hard for you to take, but a lot of it just needs saying, and I don't see anyone else out there giving out this message, and if I don't do this, who's gonna do it? And maybe if someone hears these words, maybe the whole world gets round and listens to what I'm saying, and maybe we have a chance, because I don't want to see another child crying, I don't want to see another dog dying in the street, I can't see another homeless man, because it doesn't seem right to me. He's got a home, he's not got a home, what's the point in that? Why can't we all just get together in one big home? And if I was in government, then I'd government things much more differently, because it ain't the best way to government things, so there's poor people everywhere. You know, I would just be sitting alone, thinking, how can I do something? Because I ain't gonna be in chains no more. You lot might like being conned, but I ain't being conned. Because I'm a free man. I'm free, and I'm gonna let my soul soar. And the way I do that is through my music. So why don't you do something? From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where I should note here that Lady Curmudgeon and I were in attendance at history's one and only Infant Sorrow concert, which was at the Roxy in 2010, if I'm not mistaken. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. A happy Friday. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And you do not need me to tell you that Joe Biden and the Democrats only have one way of viewing the world. When a thing happens, and the thing is bad, the only possible response, the only response that can even be contemplated, is top-down brute force action from the central government. Even if the set of measures they're proposing was already in place at the state level and did nothing to stop the bad thing from happening, they will get up there with a straight face and propose it anyway. And if you point out, hey, that's stupid and pointless, then of course they immediately announce that you love it when children get murdered. Because obviously, these are eminently sane, reasonable, well-balanced people that we're dealing with, and not a bunch of wild-eyed, barking mad lunatics. Joe Biden says we need more background checks. The Uvalde shooter passed a background check, and there is no reason to surmise that he wouldn't have passed a federal background check since he had no criminal record of which to speak. Joe Biden says we need red flag laws. Well, Texas has a red flag law. And the Uvalde shooter, based on our current understanding, was a young man who, not to belabor the point, but he enjoyed waving around bags of dead cats. It was well known that he enjoyed torturing and killing animals. And speaking of red flags, pathological animal cruelty is one of the biggest ones there is. Ask any criminal pathologist or psychologist, they'll tell you there's a bright red line you can draw between animal cruelty and mass murder. It's one of the things they use when trying to identify people who might potentially become serial killers or mass shooters. So everybody who was acquainted with this kid knew that he liked killing animals and bragging about it. They knew he had no mother and no father in his life, and they knew he owned multiple firearms, which cost around $4,000 in total, which he somehow managed to afford with the wages he earned working the drive-thru at the local Wendy's. But that's not important for our purposes right now, just something suspicious that might warrant investigation and explanation. The important thing is, what the hell good can a red flag law do when everybody who knows the potential killer ignores all the red flags that are being violently waved right up in their faces? But again, Joe Biden wants you to believe that if we duplicate this state law at the federal level, in addition to duplicating the background check law, then somehow, magically, it will prevent incidents like this from happening in the future. And I should mention here that I'm not, generally speaking, a big fan of red flag laws because I think they contain insufficient mechanisms for preventing the law being used to persecute and disarm sane, law-abiding citizens. Like, your daughter's pissed off that you grounded her for the weekend, so she calls up the cops and says, my dad's got guns and I'm afraid he'll go on a rampage, and within 17 minutes your guns are confiscated and you've been bundled into a padded van for the ride down to the county psych ward. And I'll grant you it's a very difficult balance to strike when you have to weigh public safety against the constitutional rights of the individual. But when you err, you have to err on the side of preserving the liberties of the law-abiding citizen. You just do. If you don't, then we become something that is not America. We become just another authoritarian autocracy that happens to be wearing a stars and stripes skin suit. And here's my favorite one. Joe Biden says if we allow gun manufacturers to be sued when their products are used in mass shootings, then this somehow will forestall the further occurrence of such incidents because, yes, I can see it now. The young spree killer, he grabs his trusty AR-15, he grabs his high-capacity magazine, he jumps in his car, he's got murder on his mind, he's about to drive down to the local school and just open up on everybody. He sticks his key in the ignition, he starts to turn it, but then he stops, and he thinks, you know what? If I go through with this, I might expose the manufacturer of this weapon to potential civil liability. And that's just not something I can do in good conscience. So maybe I won't murder all those kids after all. Maybe I'll just play some video games instead. Thanks, Joe Biden. It sounds absurd, because it is absurd. But none of this has anything to do with keeping kids safe or preventing school shootings. When a Democrat is moving his lips and there's sound coming out of his lie hole, he's only ever trying to do one of two things: increase the power of the Democrat Party or pander to Democrat Party donors. And so when Joe Biden says he wants to expose gun manufacturers to civil liability, he's simply tossing a big slab of red meat toward an important Democrat constituency, which is trial lawyers. And that is all this is. But please, if there are any Joe Biden fans watching and you've got a theory for how suing gun makers will prevent future mass murders, I am willing to listen to it openly and in good faith. If you want to insult me personally, that's fine too. I don't delete comments. You can say what the hell you want. But seriously, give me the innocent explanation for this. I am eager to be convinced that this is not a tawdry, cynical, self-evident sop to the trial lawyer class. And speaking of things that are self-evidently cynical, I was surprised to hear the president make reference, however briefly and obliquely, to the fact that we have a mental health crisis that is feeding the proliferation of these mass casualty events, the majority of which are perpetrated by adolescent or young adult males who have no father or other male authority figure in their lives, whether it's a coach or a clergyman, what have you. Me, I am a fairly firm believer in the idea that broken homes and fatherless children lie at the root of many of our social ills, including, to some extent, mass shootings. But if Joe Biden and the Democrats are serious about solving the mental health issue, which they totally are not, but let's pretend to give them the benefit of the doubt just for shits and giggles, then a good place to start would be with an acknowledgement and an admission that the wholesale disintegration of the American family unit has been caused in large part by policies the Democrat Party has been pursuing and implementing for the last 50 to 60 years. We used to be a country whose government actively promoted marriage and monogamy because that is what sane societies do. Sane societies understand that they need to have a future, and the way you secure the future is first by encouraging your young adult citizens to marry one another and get to work manufacturing babies at a higher than replacement level. And second, by emphasizing the importance of those children growing up in homes where they have a mother and a father who are both present, who are married to one another. But we're not a sane society, so our government stopped promoting marriage and monogamy back sometime in the 90s. Today, instead, our government promotes hedonism and profligacy. We raise young people to believe that if something makes you feel good, then you should do that thing, and there should never be any consequences for doing the thing. So if you get drunk and have unprotected sex with some random dude at some party and you turn up pregnant, you don't need to concern yourself with wondering if you should marry the random dude you had sex with and together raise the child you've created. You just need to run down to the drugstore and grab yourself an abortion pill. And if it's too late for that, no bother, just make an appointment to have the pregnancy terminated. It's probably covered by your health insurance anyway. Won't even cost you 1 red cent out of pocket. So there you go. You can behave as irresponsibly as you like, and our totally not insane society has constructed a whole edifice of different mechanisms whereby you never have to face any consequences for it. And it's kind of distressing that they understand this stuff in places like Hungary and Poland and Slovakia. But here and all across the Anglosphere, in the countries that used to be the beacons of stable Western democracy, we are too busy celebrating sexual perversion and child grooming to be bothered with promoting marriage and stable family units. Because your family unit is anything you want it to be. Haven't you heard? Well, when I grew up, I lived with my mom and my half-brother and my half-sister and my other half-brother and my mom's boyfriend and her girlfriend and her non-binary lover named pat. And look at me, I turned out perfectly normal. You can tell by my jello-colored hair and my neck tattoos and the big javelin I got sticking through my nose. So stop trying to impose your archaic 1950s morality on me, you brute. And I nearly forgot to talk about the Joe Bidenist part of this speech last night when he said, quote, "We urgently need to ban AR-15s and AK-47s. And if we can't ban them, then we need to raise the age from 18 to 21. Now, have you ever heard a president speak that way? Because I myself have not. He first says we need to do a thing, then he immediately concedes that we can't actually do it and proposes a half measure instead. Seriously, what president talks like that? We're supposed to take these as the words of a strong and decisive leader, a man with so little self-assurance that his proposals don't even survive the sentence in which he proposed them? I am old enough to remember when Jimmy Carter was the president, and we used to think that guy was weak and feckless, which, of course, he was. But next to Joe Biden, Jimmy Carter, even with his cardigan sweater on, looks like the bastard love child of John Wayne and Mr. T. But just as Jimmy Carter's administration represented the last gasp of the New Deal Democrats, so too does the Joe Biden administration represent the last gasp of the 1990s Clinton-Bush uniparty era. In both cases, right until the last day they were able to cling to power, they kept faith with the same set of failed policies that had brought economic ruin upon the country and its people right up to the very end. In 1980, when Reagan won 44 states and 489 electoral votes, the Democrats acted like they were genuinely shocked to have been ousted from power. And they didn't see the inside of the White House for 12 years after that, right up until an Arkansas governor came along who was willing to admit, those New Deal policies all failed, and we would do well to stop promoting them if we ever want to win again. And even with that much-needed injection of self-awareness, Bill Clinton never sniffs the presidency without Ross Perot cleaving off 19% of the popular vote. But the Democrats today, they are sitting on the edge of a calamity that might wind up making 1980 look rather tame by comparison. The mainstream fake news media are telling us the Republicans are expected to pick up around 30 seats in the House in the midterm in November. And that prognostication is just about right, as long as you add a 1 to the front end of that number. If the Democrats only lost 30 seats, that would be a resounding, unexpected, inexplicable triumph for them. But that's not going to happen. Because Joe Biden isn't just the worst president ever elected in his own right, allegedly. He's also worse than any of the accidental presidents who were never elected and just held down the fort when their predecessor died or was assassinated. With a sample size of 18 months, we can safely assert, backed by mountains of empirical evidence, that it is not humanly possible to do the job of president any worse than Joe Biden has done it through the first 37.5% of his term in office. Our economy has been wrecked on purpose. We've been humiliated on the world stage. Our prestige and credibility lie in ruins. Our southern border stands wide open as God knows how many miscreants and enemy saboteurs pour in by their thousands. But Joe Biden isn't bothered by any of that. He thinks he can still get you to vote Democrat in November by promising to ban the pistol you bought last year to protect your family from the hordes of violent criminals that Joe Biden's party has turned loose on the streets of your hometown. And let's make no mistake, that's exactly what we're talking about here. The legislation being proposed amounts to a backdoor ban on around 90% of the privately owned handguns in the country. For example, if you own one of the most common models of the Glock 9mm, that weapon is built to accept a 10-round magazine. But Joe Biden and the Democrats, they want to ban 10-round magazines. And there is no smaller magazine that your weapon will accept. So consequently, the gun itself isn't banned, per se, but if you continue owning the only magazine that fits in it, you're a criminal now. Isn't that fun? The weapon that Joe Biden forced you to buy to defend your family and your homestead is now just a fun paperweight. So maybe when the home invaders arrive, you can politely ask them to hold their fire while you attempt to pistol whip them into incapacity through blunt force cranial trauma. But you understand, we're just trying to keep the kids safe. And we'll leave it there for this week. Here's wishing everyone a delightful, edifying weekend. I will see you Monday. Until then, do not comply. Get off my lawn.